So this first lecture on learning, we're going to talk about learning and classical conditioning. But let's start with just the idea of learning. So for just a minute, I want you to imagine going into your favorite restaurant. When you first walk through the doors, you either read the sign that says, please wait to be seated, or it says, please seat yourself. And so you find, let's say it's seat yourself. So you go and it's your favorite Mexican restaurant. You go find your favorite booth or table that you like going to. And then what happens? Well, the waitress or waiter usually comes out with your chips and salsa. They ask you, what would you like to drink? You order your most familiar drink that you enjoy. Maybe it is a Coke or a Mountain Dew or something like that. And then once you're sitting there talking, you're eating, and when you see the waitress, you see that your drink is empty, you kind of motion. Well, how did you know to do all those things? Believe it or not, you learned that at some point in your life, right? You learned through experience. We learn through experiences all the time. But what other ways do we learn? Well, let's talk about learning more in depth and then look at the two basic, or there's going to be three different kinds of learning we're going to explore for this chapter. So the big question is, what is learning? Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. Basically, learning is the process by which which life experiences cause change in our behavior or thinking of just how the world exists. You adjust your behavior accordingly as consequences happen to you, especially those that result from your own action. Let's say you have your driver's license and you're going down the road and you've gotten a ticket in the past. Isn't that going to cause you hopefully to slow down? Maybe some of you it doesn't, but the idea is we're supposed to learn from our experience. And if you had an experience of getting in trouble for speeding, hopefully you won't speed again. There are four factors that form the definition of learning. Learning is, number one, inferred from a change in behavior or performance. Number two, learning results in an inferred change in your memory. Number three, learning is the result of experience. Number four, learning, well, if you've really learned it, it should be relatively permanent. However, just so you know, there's a little asterisk here. This means that behavior changes that are temporary or due to things like, drugs, alcohol, etc., are not necessarily learned. They're just us usually being stupid. This brings us to classical conditioning. So there's a guy by the name of Ivan Pavlov. He really is one of the most prominent figures in the history of psychology, but he wasn't a psychologist at all. He was actually a Russian medical researcher, a physiologist to be specific, who in the late 1800s devoted his professional life to the study of the digestive system. I know you're thinking, what in the world does this have to do with learning? Well, Pavlov examined secretions made by various parts of the digestive tract, including saliva, which is produced in the mouth to start the digestive process. Pavlov was measuring the amount of saliva that dogs produced when food entered their mouths when he made an accidental discovery, and this led to classical conditioning. Classical conditioning defined is learning to make an involuntary reflex response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces the reflex. I know that kind of sounds foreign right now, but by the end of today, you should have a better idea of what that definition actually means. So again, we have Ivan Pavlov, and he basically helped explain classical conditioning. So here was his experiment. He had his dogs in their harnesses, and his assistant would bring the food to the dogs. They would measure how much the dog's mouth watered with the help of this specialized equipment. But a problem arose. The dogs started salivating too soon. They weren't salivating when the food arrived, but before the food arrived. At first, this problem frustrated and perplexed Pavlov. The dogs had picked up on cues that the food was on its way. Perhaps the sight of the assistant who brought the food, or the sound of the door opening as the assistant entered the room. Think about it. If you have a pet, don't they know when they're about to get fed? And I promise you, they start salivating with the very thought of that food being delivered. So we have some terminology here that you're really going to have to be familiar with. In fact, some of your homework is going to be wrapped around this terminology. The first two terms the first three terms we're looking at is unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, and neutral stimulus. And we're going to go over this again and again today, so don't worry if I'm running too fast. So before conditioning, the food was considered an unconditioned stimulus. We know it produced salivation. So the food was the stimulus, the unconditioned response was the salivation. However, there was a tone. It was a neutral stimulus. It did not produce any salivation. It was just a tone by itself. By the way, here's the apparatus that Pavlov had his dogs hooked up to. Okay, so during conditioning, the neutral stimulus, or that tone, and the unconditional stimulus, the food, are paired, resulting in salivation. After conditioning occurred, the neutral stimulus now turns into, hey, alert, a new term, conditioned stimulus, eliciting salivation, which is now considered conditioned response. Hey, I'm going to say this again later on, but just so you know, the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response and the conditioned response will always be the very exact same thing. Okay, so let's define these a little bit more. An unconditioned stimulus, the UCS, is a natural occurring stimulus that leads to an involuntary reflex or response. So a stimulus might be, hey, somebody turns on the light in the middle of the night. That's the stimulus. But what happens? Your pupils contract. Did you have to train them to do that? No, they just did because it's unconditioned. You know what? Somebody brings you your favorite food. That food is the unconditioned stimulus. The salivation, well, it's the unconditioned response. So back to that unconditioned response. It's the involuntary reflex, and reflex is really kind of an important thing for you to keep in mind. Response to a naturally occurring or unconditioned stimulus. So examples, let's say you are excited about, or somebody scares you. Well, your reflex would be your heart rate might start increasing. You might start sweating. Ooh, you might feel nauseous or vomiting. You might have tears if wind or something blows into your eye. That is an unconditioned stimulus, but your response is your eyes tear up to try to wash it out. Salivating and blinking are also unconditioned responses. Conditioned stimuli, or a conditioned stimulus, is a stimulus that becomes able to produce a learned reflex response by being paired with the original unconditioned stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov, he used a tone or a bell, but they can also use lights, or we can even use odor. You might go, odor, what? Okay, I'm going to get a little gross here, but think of the last time you had a really bad stomach flu. Ugh, I hate that. But you had a really bad stomach flu. Next time you smelled the food that you had thrown up earlier, what does it produce? Ugh, you feel sick again. So that odor becomes a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is the learned reflex response to that previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. Remember that UCR and the UCR is always the same as the CR. The unconditioned response will always be the same as the conditioned response. So I have a few examples that we're going to go over, and if you need to, pause during each one and try to come up with for yourself what you think they are, okay? you are going to define what the unconditioned stimulus is, the unconditional response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Again, you don't have to write these down, but you are going to have to do the same exercise for your homework this week. Okay, so our first one is Pavlov's dog example, right? The UCS, or unconditioned stimulus, is the food being presented. Then the UCR, or unconditioned response, is the dog salivating. Well, maybe it was, the bowl being brought out or the steps towards the food, but that became the conditioned stimulus, and now the dog salivating is the conditioned response. I want you to take note, dog salivating, they're both the same thing. Okay, here is our next example. Let's say you get the flu bug. And of course, your unconditioned response is you're vomiting. Your body's trying to get rid of whatever that nastiness is. But unfortunately, we move back. Unfortunately, the night before, you had your favorite restaurant food. And so now, next time you go to your restaurant of choice, it is now paired with vomiting. I'm so sorry. Okay, here's a good one. Our unconditioned stimulus is sadness over a breakup. And so, of course, your unconditioned response, you're crying, you're upset. But what has been paired with that relationship or that breakup? That song that meant a lot to the relationship. That is now considered your conditioned stimulus. And your conditioned response, of course, is crying every time you hear it. Okay, another example. Let's say you have no food or you have low blood sugar, so your stomach, you have hunger pains. That is the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. Remember, those things, did you have to train yourself to be hungry? No, this is unlearned. It is a reflex. The learned is, you get hungry usually around a certain time. So sometimes you just have to look at the time. You might not even be thinking about food, but you look at the clock and go, hey, it's my lunchtime, and suddenly you have hunger pains. So that has transitioned into a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. One thing I want to take note is that this process is called pairing. Acquisition is the initial stage of classical conditioning. It associates a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus comes to elicit the conditioned response. That is a term that you will need to know. In most cases, though, for conditioning to occur, the neutral stimulus needs to come before the unconditioned stimulus, and really the timing must be very quick. It has to be between the two stimuli. It should be about a half a second. Another term that you want to be familiar with is extinction. When the unconditioned stimulus, so in the case of Pavlov, the food, does not follow the conditioned stimulus, the tone, the salivation, that conditioned response, will begin to decrease and eventually cause extinction. A disappeared CR, though, is called extinguished, not extinct. So let's say we've done this. Let's say we had trained the dog to salivate when the bell rang, but now we only ring the bell again and again and again, and we never bring the dog food. Well, the dog's going to start not salivating during the bell, right? But guess what? We can get that back through spontaneous recovery. So after a rest period, an extinguished conditioned response, I will tell you, my words do get mixed up in all of this. Conditioned response, which is salivation, will spontaneously recover. But if the conditioned stimulus or the tone persists alone, that CR will become extinct again. Okay, this is kind of a fun one. Stimulus generalization. The tendency to respond to stimuli similar to the CS is called generalization. So I have two little dogs. They're really cute, but they can be very annoying and loud sometimes. And so they love when the doorbell rings to go running for the door and bark. Well, we noticed one day we're watching TV and we were watching like Friends or something, and somebody rang the doorbell on the TV. My dogs generalized that tone and went running for our front door. And so that is just a great example to me of stimulus generalization. The flip side of that is stimulus discrimination. Discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. So Pavlov actually taught the dogs which tones would produce food and which tones would not, and they could differentiate or discriminate between those two. I know for my dogs, they came to the point where if there's a doorbell, they will look at us to see if we're going to respond. Here's the deal. Pavlov and his predecessor, Watson, believed that laws of learning were similar for all animals. Therefore, a pigeon and a person do not differ in their learning. However, behaviorists later suggested that learning is constrained by an animal's biology. So animals are predisposed to learn things that enhance their survival. Well, this brings us to good old John B. Watson. He viewed psychology as an objective science, which is generally agreed upon today, but he recommended study of behavior without reference to unobservable mental processes. This isn't so universally accepted by all schools of thought. We have kind of decided that really you cannot just judge a person based on their behavior, that we usually need to see what are they thinking when they do something. He decided, though, that he could condition an emotion. And now, I want you to know that today, conditioned fear experiments such as Albert's experience would never occur because due to ethical standards, it would cause harm. But this is what John B. Watson tried. So here is how the experiment went. Watson and his assistant Rayner, they took this little baby named Little Albert, and they exposed this baby to a whole bunch of white furry creatures. A rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, and even like a fur coat and a Santa Claus mask. And honestly, little Albert didn't mind any of these. In fact, he found that little white rabbit or the rat to be really interesting. But then one thing we do know about babies is they do not like being startled, especially with loud noises. So Watson paired the loud noise with the white furry animals. He conditioned fear into that infant. So he presented a rat, immediately followed by a loud noise, startling the baby. After a few tries, guess what? Albert, he was afraid of the rat. Albert generalized his fears to other furry objects. So I'm going to show you this quick video. I do apologize. It's really old because John Watson lived a very long time ago. But I hope that you enjoy it. I want you to take note, though. When John Watson puts on the Santa Claus mask and pursues poor little baby Albert, I honestly think anybody would be afraid.
Little Albert was first exposed to things which he had not encountered before in his short life to establish a base response. They began with fire, followed by a monkey, a dog, a rabbit, and a white rat. Notice he reacts positively to all of these neutral stimuli, often reaching out to feel the animal. He seems particularly fascinated by the rat. When the conditioning started, he was startled and fell forwards, but he did not yet cry. The second time he reached for the rat and heard the noise, he started to cry. After much more conditioning, the rabbit produced immediate tears, but the dog only produced tears when close to his head. Pushing the experiment further, a fur coat was then presented to the little Albert, who became very agitated. By the end, even a Santa mask produced a fearful response in Albert's frantic retreat.
So if we use our terminology with this little Albert experiment, this is what we come up with. The unconditioned stimulus is loud noises because it elicits the fear and crying, the unconditioned response. Remember John Watson, he paired the conditioned stimulus, the rat or the rabbit, which now produces the conditioned response of fear and crying. Remember that little Albert then generalized his fears of rats into fear of anything with white fur, including a Santa Claus mask, a rabbit, etc. Hey, just so you know, little Albert, we do not know the long-term effects of this because unfortunately, he passed away at age 6 of pneumonia. So there were no records of what happened with little Albert afterwards. Mary Cover Jones, though, she used the early form of desensitization to prove that fears or phobias could be unlearned. She used a little boy named Peter, who had an extreme fear of rabbits, which I really wish I knew. Where did he get his fear of rabbits from? But Jones gave Peter his favorite food while slowly bringing the rabbit closer and closer. Eventually, Peter no longer panicked around rabbits. This is called, again, desensitization. So I want to share with you just kind of a contextual idea about overcoming fears. So, they're manipulating baby Albert and having him be afraid of white rabbits and rats and all that. But the desensitization part is actually something that we do use in therapy. So I'm going to tell you a really quick little thing that if it's helpful to you, awesome. If it might be helpful to a friend of yours someday, awesome. So there is what we call a fear ladder. And the idea of a fear ladder is, if you think about a regular ladder, the scariest rung on the regular ladder is the top rung, right? So when we come up with something that maybe we're really afraid to do, maybe it's going on an airplane, maybe it is speaking in front of people in public, maybe it's as simple as you don't like snakes or spiders or something like that. We can actually desensitize ourselves to the things that bring us fear and anxiety. So a couple of years ago, I was putting on a workshop for kids, and I decided we were going to do a workshop on anxiety. And so, me being the creative, hands-on approach teacher I thought I'm going to overcome my fear of snakes by bringing in a snake handler and doing a fear ladder on this. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, I did not overcome my fear of snakes, just because really the idea of this is you have to do every step until you are desensitized. Well, because of the timing, I didn't have time to become desensitized, but I'm going to tell you kind of how it went. The first rung was look at the word snake. Well, that actually does not produce any anxiety for myself. So I went on to the second rung. The second rung was I think looking at a picture of a snake. Okay. Well, then I was looking at a picture of a snake that I knew at the top of my ladder was hold a snake. So I knew that this would be the snake I'd be holding. That gave me a little bit more shivers up the spine because I really hate snakes. So then the next one was have a plastic snake in my hand, which again, I work with a plastic snake in my play therapy all the time, so that didn't bother me. Get information about snakes. That is a coping mechanism I often use, educate myself about the thing that makes me scared, and it helps, I don't know, take some of the fear away from it, some of the power away. But then we started getting to kind of the more hands-on things. So the next part was the snake handler was on the stage with me, and he had his snake there. It was a a python named SpongeBob. It was albino python, so it was an orange color. And so he had SpongeBob in like this clear box. So the first step was for me to look at SpongeBob while it was still in the box. Okay, hey, you know what? I do not even like going to the snake house at the zoo. It creeps me out, but I could handle knowing it was in that box, and I could see it was in the box, and it was secure in the box. The next stage, though, is where things got a little dicey for me. I had the snake handler took out the snake, and I was supposed to touch the snake. Well, I was not prepared for what happened next. The snake's head whipped around, and its little tongue waggled at me and touched me, and I screamed. I scared the poor guy. I screamed and I jumped back. Well, at the same time, let me kind of tell you the setting I was in. It was this room that had a very, very short little stage, maybe about maybe 6 inches, maybe it was a foot tall. It wasn't very tall. So all the kids in the room were sitting up against the stage like this, with their hands, and they were just enthralled in what was going on and in the snake. And so what happened was I had these little tiny heels on, and so I jumped back when I screamed, and I felt my heel hit a kid's hand. So luckily I caught it. I was able to get up on my tippy toes, and I didn't go into his hand. But I will tell you, at that point, the adrenaline was rushing. And so again, I did not ever reach the place of desensitization. But if I were, what I would do is do it over and over and over again, not the screaming part, but touch the snake over and over again until it didn't bother me, until I was almost bored with it, okay? Before I would go on to the next step, which the next step was me putting the snake around my shoulders and holding it. And again, at the same time, I had it around my shoulders, and the snake's head kept on whipping around and looking at me, and its tongue came out, and I was just like, I'm done with this. So, funny part, both my boys happened to be in the audience. My oldest son was sitting at the stage and this is the coolest thing ever. I'm going to watch my mom get eaten by a snake right now, and this is awesome. He was loving every minute of it. My second son, though, was standing in the back with my work partner, and as soon as I gave that snake back, he burst into tears. So quickly, she gave me the glance of, you want to switch here? So I did. She went on stage and continued to teach. I went back to take care of my son, and my son's only words were, I didn't want my mom to die. So again, did we get desensitized to snakes? No, but that was more because of time. But if you do have something that you want to tackle, you know what? Think about okay, what would be, instead of diving into the deep end, what's the first step? What could you do first to try to get there? And you just do it over and over again until it's boring, and then you go on to the next step. Anyways, I hope that is helpful for you. I think at this point, we are almost done with this lecture. We just have a couple of examples for you, okay? This first example of how we use this in everyday life, and this is classical conditioning, is through advertising. Many beer ads prominently feature attractive young women wearing bikinis. The young women are the unconditioned stimulus because they naturally elicit a favorable, mildly aroused feeling, which is considered the unconditioned response in most men. The beer is simply associated with this effect. So the beer would be, you got it, the conditioned stimulus. Another example is the smell of fresh baking bread makes my mouth water. In the past, the smell of the fresh bread immediately preceded putting a piece in my mouth, which causes salivation. Through the mechanism of classical conditioning, the smell itself comes to elicit the salivation. And our last example here, and this is one that gets used not often, but it does get used. It's actually not common, but another way to treat alcoholics is to have them take a drug called antabuse. If they ingest any alcohol, they will have serious vomiting issues. The desire is to pair the vomiting with the alcoholic drink. Again, the reason we don't see this is it doesn't, for alcoholism, it actually, there are other issues usually that need to be dealt with, and so it's not always the cure that they would hope. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at operant conditioning, so I'll see you in the next slideshow.